We're an independent nonprofit ourselves. We're a research center. The research that we do is intended to inform solutions and to improve the lives of children, families, and communities that experience adversity. So all of the work that we do is really intended to be quickly translated into change in the field. Beyond that, we have a couple areas of specialization that I'd like to tell you about. Not all of our work fits perfectly into these three streams, but I think it probably describes our work overall pretty well. The first area that most folks know us from historically is child welfare. We do a lot of research and implementation work in the field of child welfare, both to prevent children from entering the child welfare system, increasingly with emphasis on preventing involvement in child welfare and certainly on preventing foster care placement. We have a great deal of work in community capacity, and that really ranges from small projects that we do in partnership with members of community, as well as with nonprofits and community development entities that are often collaboratives of some sort. We believe very much in working with community and community members to help realize assets, and really think it's important, if we're going to put together sustainable interventions from the individual all the way to the population level, that we have to be working from an understanding of strengths and to use those strengths to help make better outcomes. And finally, we do a lot of work on youth and family homelessness, and that work is part of our discussion today. We have a very large portfolio in ending youth homelessness, and beyond that, I myself, as well as Cara and Melissa, my colleagues on the webinar today, have done a lot of work in helping to identify housing instability and homelessness among families involved in early childhood. So I'll pause a little bit and tell you about myself as a professional. I'm a researcher by training. I am a clinical and school psychologist by training, and really function more as a community psychologist. I began my career doing home visiting in early intervention and child welfare in the New York City area. I have a deep appreciation for the work of early intervention. I did home-based and community-based early intervention services for a long time, often with families who had a lot of economic stress as well. So I was introduced to the notion of housing instability and homelessness and its effects on families with young children, both from that standpoint, and also because I was, as part of my first job, I also was a developmental consultant in, at the time, a transitional housing shelter for families experiencing homelessness. And housed inside of that was a very large early Head Start and Head Start program. So I understood very quickly the many challenges that present for families who have a lot of moves, including at the time, the model for supporting families experiencing homelessness was often these transitional shelters. We've moved away from that model, and I think I know a little bit about why, because adding more transitions to families who already have lots of them is just adding more transitions. So I'm delighted to be with you today. Cara and Melissa and I will share different parts of this work around early childhood and how we can shore up families who experience housing instability and homelessness. And we'll start by talking to you a little bit about how to define homelessness, and then really thinking about how to identify sources of instability in families, in particular families with young children who may or may not be enrolled in early childhood programs. So I'm going to pass the microphone, so to speak, right now to Cara Karter, who's sitting with me in Chicago. And then we'll hear from Melissa Cull, who is, I think, at home in New Jersey.
Hello, this is Cara Karter. I'm the coordinator of research support here at Chapin Hall. I work directly underneath Anne as our director of research. I am a Chicago native. I have a bachelor's degree in social and economic development policy from the Illinois Institute of Technology here in Chicago. I have some experience using translational and community-driven research to amplify participant voices and build community capacity, particularly around the area of enriching child and adolescent development. I had prior experience working as a research and evaluation specialist at a large after-school provider here in Chicago, After School Matters, and also formerly served as research assistant here at Chapin Hall. I also joined Anne in supporting her role as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Child and Family Studies as the editorial manager. Thank you for having me. Melissa?
And I am a trained developmental psychologist. So in my prior work, I've focused on understanding the factors in children's lives and in their broader communities and school contexts that impact their development. Much of my work has focused on understanding the role of instability in the lives of children and families. And as Anne mentioned, much of my work at Chapin Hall really focuses in both the ending youth homelessness portfolio as well as within the community capacity portfolio. I've also previously worked at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, where I have spent time developing, implementing, and evaluating a variety of community and school-based mental health programs. So I would say that my work really sits at the intersection of schools and communities. I'm really trying to understand the nature of housing instability and homelessness, as well as broad-based family instability. So I'll kick it back to Anne now.
So before we go much further, we want to find out a little bit more about our audience today. And we're looking, I'm going to actually kick it back to Maria to do a quick poll.
All right, Anne. So I'm going to throw up a couple of polls here for us. Our first one is just finding out who all is in our room with us today. So hopefully you can see the poll that is up on the screen. And all right, we'll give folks a little bit of time to respond to that poll. In just a few minutes, I will share the results as I see more folks finishing up the poll. And while we're waiting on the results of this poll, I do want to let you know that we have question breaks built in throughout the presentation. So if you do have a question, please type it in the chat box. We're monitoring those questions. So if there is something that we can address right then and there, we will. But we will definitely be addressing questions in the during the question breaks as well. All right, looks like still got a few more people to respond, but I'm going to go ahead and show the poll now so we can get a good idea of who all is in our room. So it looks like we've got a lot of early intervention providers, some early childhood educators, family services, a variety of different folks. So thank you all for sharing that. And I'm going to stop sharing that. We've got a couple of polls in a row here that we're going to do. So for those of you who are in early intervention, we are kind of curious to see what your roles are as far as early intervention. So if you could identify yourself through this poll so we can kind of just get a feel for who's in our group. We'll give folks a few seconds to finish that. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share those results so everyone can see that. So we've got quite a few folks that are CFC staff, and then a mix of different provider types throughout there. If you're an other, yeah, let us know what your other role is in the chat box. That would be awesome. And one of our questions on our chat box is, can you define CFC for me? So absolutely. CFC stands for Child and Family Connections. It's the central point of entry for all of our children who enter into early intervention. So yes, please, anytime you see something that you have questions about, please type it in the chat box. All right, I'm going to move to the next poll. So like I said, we had a few here in a row. So our next poll is about your experience. How much of your work focuses on families experiencing homelessness? We'll get a feel for what that might look like. Oh, great. Thanks, G-Lane, Child Care Resource and Referral. Thanks so much. Welcome. Okay, and Stacy says you see anyone that has court business, so you see a lot of different folks with some experience in homelessness. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here. I see that, that there might be a few of you that are having difficulty seeing the poll. It may be how you're logged on. If you're logged in on a tablet or a smartphone, it may look a little different. But here are our results for those families that are experiencing homelessness. Looks like you've got a significant folks that have had a little touch with it. So hopefully that will give you some insight into who the audience is today. And then one last poll before we continue on. And this is just to find out how many of you are familiar with the research related to homelessness. So I've popped that poll up in the window there. Give folks a few more seconds to answer. So Anne, Cara, and Melissa, this is the information that we have about the people who have the information about research and for familiarity with research and policy. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. So I'm gonna stop sharing that, and I'm gonna turn it back over to you to move forward.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks to all of you for participating in the poll. So what we'd like to talk with you about today, first of all, is definitions of homelessness. And you might think, why? So I guess it's a really good question. Why do we define homelessness in different ways? And the reality is that most of us think about homelessness in our own unique ways. When you say something about homelessness, it evokes a picture in most people's mind. Unfortunately, sometimes that's a picture of a person with a shopping cart in an urban environment or even a rural environment. It may mean a person sleeping under a bridge. We tend to stereotype housing instability and homelessness. And the reality is that homelessness affects Americans of all stripes. It disproportionately affects people of color, and in particular, people who are born into families that experience intergenerational poverty. So we can think about homelessness in a fairly traditional way along the lines of, well, homelessness means you don't have a roof over your head. And I think for most of us, that's the obvious answer. But homelessness has durational qualities. So how long have you been homeless? How many nights in a row did you not have a place to sleep? Are you a single person? Do you have a family? Are you part of a couple? How old are your children if you're a parent? All of these questions go to definitional issues. And one of the really important reasons that definitions matter is because they drive services in different systems that we have. So we might think about homelessness related to, Melissa was talking about homelessness, sorry, there we go. We're having trouble advancing the screen. So Melissa was talking about the effects of instability on child development. And so we can think about that with respect to early childhood. We can think about it with respect to children who are school-aged and in adolescence, and all the way through college and adulthood and late adulthood. So what happens, though, is supports and services for individuals across systems, health, education, housing, really depend on eligibility. So each federal agency has to come up with eligibility standards, and those standards typically emerge from definitions. So we'd like to talk to you today about three different definitions of homelessness. One is the federal definition that comes from the U.S. Department of Education, which is on your screen. One is from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the authority in this country that's responsible for housing. And finally, we'll talk about the definition that's offered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. We're starting with the U.S. Department of Education. And the words on your screen, I think, to some extent reflect a common notion of what housing instability or homelessness might be. When you think about it from an education standpoint, it would be a child and or a family member who's living someplace, sleeping someplace that's not meant for sleeping. That could be a train station, a car, a bus station, an abandoned building, a bus. It could mean an emergency or transitional shelter, if that's available in an individual's given community. It may mean spillover accommodations in motels or hotels that are sometimes part of a plan to temporarily house folks, and sometimes it's just a landing place for someone who can scrape together enough resources to do that for a night or two. We also talk about a term called doubling up. And doubling up, simply stated, is when you have at least two families, or families by any definition, living together in a place that was really only intended for one. So you might have experienced this yourself for a period of time, or you might know many families who go and live with a relative or a friend who provides accommodation for a period of time because I've lost housing or because of some version of economic hardship. In the best of circumstances, these are short-term transitional arrangements. Even in the best of circumstances, they are fraught with different forms of vulnerability because, as we all know, if you're doubling up with someone, it's causing a hardship all around, and it's very common for the hosting tenant to have to ask the person who's temporarily doubled up to leave. And that might even have to happen for legal reasons, because a landlord, for example, may say that the apartment is not habitable by that many people. So in the best of circumstances, families might have someone to turn to. Those arrangements are often very tentative and may be vulnerable. For very young parents, there are other forms of vulnerability built into those circumstances that can make the experience even more difficult and more tentative, and frankly exert pressure on families and on parents that are the kinds of pressures that none of us would ever want a family member to experience. So HUD is the provider of another definition, and the most recent legislation through which this is defined is the HEARTH Act of 2009. It's similar to the U.S. Department of Education or McKinney-Vento definition, but it also defines at risk. So some federal definitions will concern themselves with families who aren't frankly or literally homeless, will also consider the risk of homelessness. So the HEARTH Act concerns itself with families who are in untenable housing circumstances. So one of those is this first bullet, which is your income is less than 30% of the area median income. So sometimes you might hear the term AMI, and that's area median income. So if your income is less than 30% of the median for your geographic area, that's problematic, because it most certainly would mean that you're spending a higher share of your income on housing than is reasonable. And the minimum federal definition of the percentage of your income that you ought to be spending on housing is that 30%. So when you start thinking about, gee, what's not sustainable? It's not really considered sustainable if you're spending more than 30% of your income on rent, and likewise, you're at risk if your income is less than 30% of the area median. And flowing from that are ideas like insufficient resources for stability, no savings to rely on, insufficient income, frequent moves. If sometimes the best predictor of the future is the past, and we know that families and individuals who have a lot of moves in the past are more likely to have moves in the future. Clearly, someone who's got an eviction notice is at risk for homelessness. Living in a hotel or motel, same reason, it's not a sustainable picture. Overcrowded or doubled up, or exiting an institution. And that's every kind of institution you can imagine. It might be a residential or congregate care circumstance for a young person who's leaving the foster care system. It might mean someone who's leaving a support system for developmental disabilities. It might mean an individual who's been incarcerated. So there are a whole range of institutions that house people, including colleges, and sometimes young people in particular are at risk in these circumstances because they are not sustainable. So the Hearth Act, it concerns itself with not just frank or literal homelessness, but also people who are on the verge of it. And finally, we have the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which defines both homeless and at risk among young people. So a homeless youth is defined as an individual under 21 who can't live safely with a relative and has no other alternative. And at risk would be a young person who has a history of running away from their primary resident, has a parent or guardian or other form of custodian who's not willing to provide their basic needs, or an individual who is at risk of entering the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system as a result of lack of services to family. And so we won't go too far into that, but you should know that sometimes young people in these precarious circumstances with their own families, in some states, what happens is those folks enter the child welfare system, or in some cases when someone's in the juvenile justice system and they don't seem to have a reliable form of housing, they are referred to the child welfare system. So at times, because we've never had in this country a single formal system that's responsible for managing housing instability and homelessness, we've sometimes had systems that have had to cover individuals for whom they have other responsibilities. And that's true both for child welfare and juvenile justice. So I'm going to transition to Dr. Cull, who's going to talk a little bit about the systems that serve families and to move a little bit more into the heart of our discussion today.
Thanks so much, Anne. So I hope you all have a sense now from Anne's description of the different definitions of homelessness that there are many ways we can think about what homelessness is and what it entails. Anne did mention also that each of those definitions might in fact determine the eligibility for specific programs that are funded through those federal agencies. And so you might be wondering which systems are serving families experiencing homelessness. And what we know is that children experience a whole different range of influences on their growth and their development, and that their families are likely to interact with a variety of different systems that they may be seeking out in order to promote their children's development. So one example might be the healthcare system. We don't often think about how many families experiencing housing instability and homelessness are engaging with the healthcare system. I'm sure many of you who are doing work in early intervention happen to know of families in your care or in your service who have experienced these issues. And so what we know is that there are families engaging with all of these different human services systems who happen to be experiencing homelessness. And while Anne mentioned that, I'm just trying to get the slide to advance.
Hang on, sorry, I gotta give you your control. Hang on just a second.
No, no worries. Thanks, Maria.
Yep, sorry. Okay, now you should be able to control it.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. So as I've mentioned, we know that there are a host of different systems that families experiencing homelessness have to engage with. This figure here, I think on the right-hand side, really nicely illustrates where young people sit in these different influences on their development and on their health. And so we can think about the role of things like schools and neighborhoods and the economy and the systems that are embedded within the context as potentially engaging with families and children who are experiencing homelessness. And while Anne mentioned that there is not a single system that is responsible for handling issues and providing resources amongst families experiencing housing instability and homelessness, there is what's called the Continuum of Care. And this only exists in some communities who receive funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We know that homelessness can often be hidden, and so some of what we know from the Continuum of Care may not be entirely reliable in terms of estimates of homelessness, but the responsibilities of the Continuum of Care are really important for this population. So the COC, as we refer to it, is responsible for helping to provide the resources and to funnel funding from HUD to local communities. So this organization, the Continuum of Care, is hosted by different organizing bodies all across the country, and they help communities figure out what the needs of the population are, and they are responsible for a host of different activities. One of these activities is outreach, which involves stepping out into the community to try to understand and provide resources to families who are actively experiencing homelessness. Another responsibility is to provide emergency shelter and make sure that families who are experiencing a moment of crisis have access to somewhere where they can go. Another responsibility is transitional housing, which is short-term or temporary housing arrangement for families who need an opportunity to bridge a gap in a moment of crisis that they anticipate may last an extended period of time. And that also includes rapid rehousing. And then finally, permanent supportive housing is another responsibility of the COC, which is typically reserved for higher need families as well as single adults. So why might we be concerned about homelessness in the early years? I think this is a big question. It's really what's motivating our webinar today. And so I wanted to take a moment to pause here and let people use the chat box and highlight some of the concerns that come up when they think about serving families and children experiencing homelessness in the work that they do day in and day out. So I'll ask that folks take a minute to think on this and add a couple comments into the chat box, and we'll try to see what folks are experiencing and why this is an issue that they are recognizing requires more attention.
Right. We're seeing some responses come in. Julie's talking about trauma and instability effects in child's development and learning. Are you seeing these, Melissa, coming through?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, these are great.
Yeah. Susan says it's sometimes difficult to ask families to engage with early intervention around child development when they don't even know where they're going to sleep at night. Oh, wow. They're starting to really pop in here. The stress can stunt development, lack of focus. Wow. Let's see.
Yeah. Yeah, highlighting a question around food insecurity
Yes.
and consistent routines.
Trickles down to each family member. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's really interesting for us to see that you all have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what's going on with the families and the young children that you're surveying. And so I feel like, given what you all have said, perhaps this slide wasn't necessary, but I'll just take a moment to talk a little bit about the effects of homelessness in the early years. And so we know from the scientific literature, and it sounds like you all do as well, but homelessness can really have a detrimental impact on our lives at any point during the life course. But we know that among young children, the impact of homelessness can be felt even more acutely. In the early years of their lives, their bodies and their brains and their relationships are still developing. And so an experience of trauma or instability that often accompanies homelessness can be really detrimental in that it can promote over a consistent period of time, it can promote the development of toxic stress, which we know has long-term negative impacts on children's health and their development. And so we also know that young children who have experienced homelessness were more likely to experience developmental delays. And as a result of the instability of having to move from place to place and not having a consistent place to live, young children may not have consistent or regular access to important early learning opportunities, whether that's participating in early intervention activities or whether that's accessing their early education classroom. And we also know that children's greatest influences during these years of their lives, their parents. And so when homelessness affects their parents, it can really trickle down, as some were saying, into the relationship between the child and the parent. So not being able to meet your family's basic needs, like having a place to live, can be extremely stressful for parents. And we know from the scientific literature that parental stress is associated with challenges to parenting behaviors, and that can ultimately impair the relationship between the child and the parent. And as Anne mentioned earlier, and in much of the work we do at Chapin Hall, we focus on young people experiencing homelessness, and we've come to see that young parents are particularly at risk. And so for those who are experiencing homelessness with their young children, they are adding this stress, which is compounding on an already existing history of adversity that may include family trauma or interpersonal violence. And so these are some of the reasons why we're really concerned about homelessness in the early years of children's lives. Sorry for the delay, I'm just trying to advance the slide. Okay, great. So hopefully I've made the case to you all that homelessness during this time is really important. We also know from some of the findings from HUD that approximately 1.3 million children under the age of 6 experienced homelessness in a recent year. We also saw that most of the children who are living in HUD-funded shelters were likely to be under the age of 6. So this raises a lot of concerns about the quality and the context of these shelters and what sort of experiences children have there in terms of the learning opportunities that they might be exposed to. And I also want to continue to stress that homelessness during childhood is really quite prevalent. And I'm saying that, acknowledging that this graph here on the right-hand side only ranges from 0 to 1%. But I think what we really want to focus on here is the shape of this trend. So homelessness is most common amongst very young children, and then it becomes slightly less common as children reach school age. It increases again in the early years of adulthood, and then finally decreases as young people age into adults. And so here we're really trying to underscore the importance of recognizing early childhood as not only a time of important growth and development, but also as a period of time in which young families are most likely to experience economic instability that could result in homelessness. Okay, great, thank you, Maria.
You're welcome. Yeah.
So I just
wanted
want
to
to pause here.
Any questions that anyone has. I've been looking through the chat box. Looks like Susan wants to know, why do you think we see that trend represented in the graph?
Sure. So as I was mentioning, we know that the early years of childhood are most likely to be economically stressful for families. So it's a period of time when families are transitioning into getting their children into childcare or waiting until they are entering formal schooling. And so this might result in families not being as engaged in the workforce as they need to be in order to sustainably exit from homelessness. So that's just one possibility why we might see the rates of homelessness dropping as children begin to age.
All right, thank you. And as I'm scrolling through, I'm not seeing any other questions right now. So I think we can probably go forward.
Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to try another poll question here. Maria, I'll let you navigate the polling, but we're really curious to know whether you all have heard of or how familiar you are with the Home at Head Start initiative.
So I put the poll up on the screen, and you've got 4 options there to choose from. So we'll give folks a few seconds to do that. Still seeing a bunch of results come in, so we'll give it a few more. If you haven't already responded to this poll, if you could do so, that would be great. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share the results of our poll. It looks like most folks haven't heard of it. So this will be very useful information because I had never heard of it either. So I'm glad to hear, I want to hear more.
Great. So we know that some of you are early childhood providers. You may not necessarily be Head Start providers. We work closely with a Head Start organization, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I did want to take this opportunity to share a little bit about this Home at Head Start initiative, because it's a new initiative that was developed in 2019 by Deborah Bergeron, who is the director of the Federal Office of Head Start. And I think it's a really interesting initiative, and they have some cool resources. So I'm glad to be able to share it with you. The goal of this initiative is really to try to get more Head Start programs to enroll children who are experiencing homelessness across the country. We know that there are quite a lot of children who are age eligible and income eligible for Head Start who happen to be experiencing homelessness and are not enrolled. And we also know that high quality early learning experiences are most beneficial for young children who have the greatest need for them. So this really highlights an important opportunity here for Head Start to connect with these families. And so to achieve this goal, Head Start's website for professional development resources, which is called the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center, has begun to host these different modules about homelessness. And so these modules or these resources help providers who are looking to better understand what families experiencing homelessness go through and what sort of resources might be available to them in their communities. So these modules, there are, I think, about a dozen of them. They explain what homelessness is and how early childhood providers can help support families. It also helps them figure out who in their communities do they need to call to understand what resources might be available through the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, and as well as to connect them to other learning resources, such as the Sesame Street episode about a young person experiencing homelessness. So it's a really neat initiative, and it has some great resources, and we'd encourage you all to take a look. Okay. Sorry, Maria, I'm just trying to get the slide to advance. Okay, so as we start to wrap up this section, I just wanted to highlight why it's important for early childhood service providers, whether you're providing early learning services or early intervention services, understanding what homelessness is and how it affects family and what the landscape of resources are for these families is really important. One of the things that I think is most essential here is that better understanding this landscape and these issues at hand really helps service providers develop new partnerships, particularly as they try to strengthen referral pathways and make more targeted and strategic referrals that families need, and that really help them to acquire the resources that they're looking for. It's also important that young children who are experiencing homelessness and don't have a regular place to live or a consistent routine get access to these early learning opportunities. As I mentioned earlier, we know that high quality services are really most beneficial, and they have the greatest impact for the children who need them most. By accessing early learning opportunities, this can help to break the intergenerational cycle of homelessness and housing instability. As we know, early learning opportunities can help propel children onto positive developmental and educational trajectories that might ultimately help them to avoid homelessness in their early and later adulthood. And additionally, we also know that early learning opportunities are essential for the development of school readiness skills. And so as we think about, in the immediate term, preparing young children for the entry to formal schooling, we really need to think about young children who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability and making sure that they have access to these opportunities early in life so that they can go to school ready to learn. All right, and so I will kick it over to Cara now.
Thank you. So one question we want to answer is how we can find and support families experiencing housing instability. We think early childhood service providers have a unique insight into families' lives because you're able to build a relationship with families over time in most cases, and that allows you to build a great degree of trust. However, as we mentioned earlier, homelessness can often be a hidden issue. So even with that unique relationship, it can still be difficult for providers to identify families in need and also to identify the appropriate level of support to provide to those families. So with that question in mind, our team here at Chapin Hall partnered with the Early Learning Division of Action for Bridgeport Community Development and a local supportive housing provider, the Connection Incorporated in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to develop and pilot a tool to assist the family workers in ABCD's Head Start and Early Head Start programs to identify and support families in their programs who are experiencing homelessness or who might be at risk for homelessness. So as part of that partnership, we developed a tool, the Q-Raft, Quick Risks and Assets for Family Triage, which I'll show you if the slide will advance.
Yeah.
Click on the screen again.
Sorry, we're still having struggles here.
All right, I'll go ahead and advance.
Thank you. So the quick risks and assets for family triage is a 3-item instrument, is adapted from a 3-item instrument, the QRAFT, that was used and developed by Farrell here at Chapin Hall and her colleagues in Connecticut at the University of Connecticut as part of a federal demonstration project for families in the child welfare system. That partnership also included the Connection Incorporated, who was also our partner on this QRAFT-DC project. So they used that original 3-item QRAFT in connection with the Connection Incorporated and the Connecticut Department of Children and Families to provide tailored supportive housing services to those child welfare involved families in the demonstration. The QRAFT has three housing items that I'll show you in a bit, and I'll show you a little bit more about how we use the instrument. As part of our pilot in Bridgeport, we asked a subset of the family workers who would be using the tool to first kind of test the tool with their families in mind and let us know if they have any revisions. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about what the resulting instrument looked like. Maria, can you advance the slide? So based on their review, they asked us if we could add 7 additional items. Those items were added based on common needs that they saw among their families that they wanted to track more thoroughly. And they also had the idea to include as part of the instrument an automated formula that would let them know when they should be referring families. ABCD has an existing referral guide that they were able to send to me, and I built out in the instrument that I'm going to demonstrate in a minute. And you'll see how, as part of doing the screening of the QRAFT with their families, they were then prompted to refer them based on our conversations of when that would be appropriate. Before we started our data collection, we also had Anne go to Connecticut and provide a training with the family workers that included these little vignettes of what a sample family might be going through, and to complete the QRAFT EC based on those vignettes so that they got some experience scoring. And that was really important so that we would have some degree of reliability in how these family workers were using the QRAFT. So what you see on this slide are the QRAFT EC housing items. So those 3 original items. Those are current housing, housing condition, and housing history. And you'll see that those are scored on a 0 to 4 scale, with 0 being an asset or not a barrier, all the way to 4 being a severe barrier. And that 3 and 4 is shaded because at that level is when they should be referred for additional supports, or in the case of the federal demonstration, randomized into the, well, Anne can talk to you about that.
Randomized into the study, but that's not relevant here. Really, what's relevant is that these are unsustainable housing circumstances or past housing circumstances that signify a likelihood of continuing and future housing instability and homelessness.
Thank you, Anne. The other thing we did when we were developing the QRAFT EC adaptation of the QRAFT was to try to align the items more with those federal definitions that Anne went through with you earlier. So that includes the HEARTH Act, and you'll notice here the highlighted portions of the text align with HUD's definition of homelessness. We also included some language from the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, so that's the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as some language that is both from education and also aligns with that same Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. And you'll see that some of the language across the federal definitions is included in multiple acts. So this is a nice way for us to see how our screening instrument is aligning with what the federal agencies might be defining as homelessness or at risk for homelessness. So we also really wanted to spend some time demonstrating the instrument with you so you can get to see how the family workers and Head Start were using it with their families. So Maria's going to take us over to the browser. Thank you. And hopefully I'll be able to control this. Okay, it's not going to work, but Maria, will you
Keep
just
trying. Keep trying. I touched my mouse while you were trying to take over, so I can't do that.
Okay.
So
Thank you all for hanging with us as we work through this technical issue.
just click on the screen and then you should be able to take over.
Maria, it's still not, oh, there we go.
Okay.
Maybe.
No.
No, okay.
Okay,
So Maria, can you just scroll down for me?
sure.
So one thing we asked the family workers to do was to input the household size and annual household income. And then I populated this helpful little table that lets them know whether a family might be eligible based on those median income requirements that Anne mentioned earlier for a housing choice voucher.
Maria, you've not given us control of your screen. I think that's the issue here. At least it's not showing up at our end.
Cara's got control. You want me to give
Oh,
it?
that's both of us.
Oh.
No, right, it shouldn't be Cara, it should be me.
That would be the
Got
problem.
it.
There we go. Yep, there you go.
Okay.
We've got it.
Okay, so I'll go to the next page. Thank you. Thank you all for bearing with us. So here's the QRAFT EC instrument. So the first three factors here are those three housing factors: current housing, housing condition, and housing history. So let's say we have a family that's doubled up. That would be a moderate barrier. They have unsustainable housing because they're living in an unstable doubled up situation, so they don't know how long they're going to be able to stay with friends or relatives. And they have a moderate barrier in terms of housing history. So maybe they have one explainable eviction, or they have a criminal record. So we have other items here. These are the additional items that the family workers wanted included. So if the parent's in good health, that's an asset. No substance abuse history. Maybe they have a high school diploma, but don't have any really established marketable skills. They make good use of the income they do have, but they don't have a lot of it. Maybe this family has a good, stable network of friends and family. They are living doubled up. They're great parents, that's an asset. But perhaps because they're doubled up and looking for work, their kids are missing Head Start 2 days of each week. And then the family worker could input some comments here that they would have to track their work with the family or to know any other issues. Then you'll see on the next page here, those referrals. So again, these came directly from the existing referral guide that the Head Start program had. So they wanted to know whether the family has an open DCF case, and that's because there were some specific waivers and supports that they would then be eligible for. This family does not.
DCF is the Child Welfare Agency in the state of Connecticut.
Thank you. So if they are able to refer the family to the local 211, that's the Continuum of Care line for Connecticut. There's also some other housing supports that they could possibly link the family to. They could just click in here and then track that they had made that referral. And the same for all of these other things. Head Start attendance, maybe they're prompted, they want to call and address those attendance concerns, or maybe they go on a home visit. And that's it for the form. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint, that would be great, Maria.
Okay.
So in the meantime, you can see that the form really focuses the family services workers' attention on these specific concerns. That list of 10 items was generated by the family services workers, as Cara said, because those are the concerns that most frequently emerged in their very close work with families.
So within our 1 month pilot of doing the QRAFT with ABCD in Connecticut, there were 922 forms submitted by family workers. What we did with those forms was every week I would send a report back to the department at ABCD so that they could then link that into their existing system. Then that way they could track their engagements with families over time. And they also worked with the supportive housing provider, which we'll talk through further, to provide additional supports. So at 14 out of the 15 sites, we had those forms submitted, and that was a really great response rate. We were super happy with our partnership, and we'll talk more about how we're moving that partnership forward. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa in a minute to talk through more of the results from this data collection with the QRAF DC. But the one thing I did want to mention is that even though most of the information on family needs that's captured in the QRAF was already part of the Head Start intake assessment, the family workers noted to us that it was still a very valuable tool to reflect on their engagement with families over time and to follow up on any referrals that they had made maybe at the very beginning of seeing a family. So I'll turn it over to Melissa now, and we maybe go to the next slide.
Thanks, Cara. So Cara really set up nicely what the QRAF EC is. And you can see here from the 3 items that Cara described on housing, we identified that 4% of families were experiencing a significant or severe housing risk. And this was determined by a score of 3 or 4, which aligns with the federal definitions for homelessness, on any of those 3 housing items. So about 4% of all of the families who completed the QRAF, or all of the families on whom ABCD has data related to housing risk, we saw that about 4% of those families were experiencing significant or severe risk. This included, just to remind you, things like living in places that are not fit for human habitation. This could be really severe or unsafe housing. We saw about half of families had mild or moderate housing issues. And so as you might have remembered from the earlier slide, these were issues related to housing that didn't necessarily meet the criteria for a federal definition for homelessness, but were still important to consider. So these are families who are experiencing things like experiencing family issues that were interfering with their likelihood of having a stable place to live, or they could have had a place to live that was safe, but that they didn't expect to be stable. So these are sometimes understood to be issues that are at the doorstep of homelessness, or what might be an experience that then meets the criteria for homelessness. And then we also found that about 47% of families had housing assets. So they didn't have any risks, and they found that their housing was safe and stable and secure. Thanks, Maria. So here on this slide, you can see we conducted some basic descriptive analyses. On the left-hand side of this table, we have the QRAF EC items. In the middle column, you can see these are families who had the significant or severe housing risks. And then on the right-hand side, these are the families who had the mild to moderate risks. And across the board, you can see that these average QRAF scores are significantly higher for those families who were experiencing housing risks. And this is particularly the case for the items on income management, social networks, parenting, and Head Start attendance. And so as Cara alluded to earlier, these findings might not necessarily be surprising, but they are striking because we know from the scientific literature that experiences of homelessness and housing instability can co-occur with families' economic issues, with their social support networks, with their parenting skills, and with their ability to get their children to their Head Start classrooms. We're not necessarily surprised that these scores might be significantly higher for families experiencing homelessness or housing instability, but these findings do raise really important questions about the types of resources and services that families need when they're presenting with a housing risk. Thank you. So Cara mentioned that we also spent a little bit of time talking with the family service workers about their experiences using the QRAF EC. And she also mentioned that Anne had gone to Connecticut and run a training And so this was an opportunity after the QRF EC was completed and all the data were collected to reflect with the family service workers on what their experiences were of using this tool and engaging with families about their housing issues. So we asked things in this focus group, like about the ease of use, what sort of issues or questions they had about the language, and whether they felt like this type of tool, the screener, was relevant for families. Generally, the family service workers said that they felt the QRF was really easy to use, and it only took them a few minutes to complete. They did tell us that they wanted to reword one of the items, and this was a really important point that they made that helped us better understand some of these nuances. They wanted us to change the current housing item to capture this idea that families can live in places that are safe and adequate, and they can be paying market rate rent, but still find that those housing situations are not affordable or ultimately sustainable. And so it was a really important distinction that they helped make. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So let's pause here and see if there are any questions.
I've been monitoring the chat box, and I haven't seen any questions come in. So if you do have any questions, please type them in. We're going to be covering strategies here in just a little bit. So I'm not seeing any, Melissa, so I think we can probably move forward.
Great. Okay. So now I just wanted to take a moment and talk about what resources families experiencing homelessness and housing instability need the most. Do we want to take a moment to pause and see if folks have thoughts about this? I think we're doing okay on time.
We are. So yeah, so use your chat box to respond to the question on the screen. What resources do families experiencing homelessness and housing instability need most? From your experiences, what have families shared with you that they need? Use your chat box to reply. So we've got food, clothing, clean clothes, child care, financial assistance coming in. And Sarah has a question that you can address as well here. Has your research resulted in housing and or resources?
So I would say that in this work that we're doing in Bridgeport, Connecticut, it has not resulted in additional housing resources, but there are new resources that have emerged as a result of our findings from the QRF EC, and I will talk about that in a moment.
It looks like we're seeing some transportation supports, bus passes, links to transitional housing, seasonal appropriate clothing is another big deal.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, resources to even launder clothes, that's true.
Yeah, yeah, those are great points. All right.
Managing financial resources, that's a comment from Rebecca. Employment, assistance with bills, lots of different answers coming through.
Yeah, a lot of variability here, absolutely. All right, so thanks everyone for weighing in. Let's advance to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about the new resources that emerged in Connecticut, largely as a consequence of what we've learned from the QRF EC. So I want to just take a moment and talk about a program called Homeworks. What we really recognized from our findings from the QRF EC was that families needed additional support, right? This is not a surprise to anyone. The family service workers felt that the referral page was really useful and helpful, but the family service workers are not equipped to deal with all of the nuances and all of the complexities of the housing systems in Connecticut. So as I mentioned, the Continuum of Care provides these different resources to families and communities across the country, but navigating those resources is really hard. So in partnership with The Connection, who helped to create the QRAF EC. They were one of the partners at the table as that work was getting off the ground. What we decided to do, along with ABCD, was to try to establish a more clear referral pathway, and that emerged as a program called Homeworks. So how it works is ABCD identifies those families who scored a 3 or a 4 on any of the QRAF EC items, and they get referred to this Homeworks program, which sits at TCI. And within this program, there's a housing navigator. So once a family is referred to the housing navigator, it's that person's responsibility to conduct an intake assessment to try to understand exactly what family's needs are. Do they have unpaid utility bills? Are they about to be evicted? Why might they be getting evicted? And what's going on in their lives? And so the role of this navigator then is to help families meet those needs. So TCI is able to help them do things like pay those utility bills or talk to their landlords. There are a host of different things that the navigator is responsible for that are specific to housing. And then together, TCI and the Head Start Family Service Workers help to manage the case management services that those families need. So it's really a collaborative effort between these two organizations, one that's primarily responsible for early learning services, and one that's primarily responsible for housing and other sort of broad-based case management services to make sure that families are having their needs met across a variety of different domains. Okay, next slide. Perfect. So on my last slide here, I just want to take another moment and pause and let you know that in conversation with ABCD and TCI, as well as in some of the other work we've been doing in Connecticut, we've really been hearing a lot about the more widespread need for actual housing placements. And so we've been doing some work that Anne can talk a little bit more about for those of you who are interested on a supportive housing demonstration for families involved in the child welfare system in Connecticut. We had a 5-year grant funded by the Children's Bureau, the Federal Children's Bureau. And that project, along with the work we've been doing with ABCD and TCI, has really helped us to understand what families need. When we think about supportive housing, we know it includes a couple different things, and families have, and our engagement with staff have helped us to narrow down what these primary elements are. So for many families, those who are currently experiencing homelessness or on the verge of homelessness, what they often really need more than anything else, as you all have mentioned, is a housing voucher or placement. They really need somewhere to live because the place that they're living is not sustainable or it's not safe. In addition to a place to live, they want to clearly understand what makes them eligible for certain programs and resources. We've heard from family service workers and from other staff at TCI that there's a lot of confusion about what families might be able to access based on what definition of homelessness they might need or they might meet. So understanding the eligibility requirements is really important. They also want to engage with staff who are supportive and kind and help them feel hopeful about their situations. And I think some of you have also referred to that in terms of what families really need. And then finally, families want individualized case management and services that specifically meet their needs. And we've found in some of the other work that we've done in Connecticut that together, these 4 elements have proven to be really beneficial for families, particularly those families at risk of involvement in the, at risk of a child welfare incident, or a maltreatment incident. So we're seeing benefits of these different components of a program for really high need families. And we're hopeful that in the future there will be additional opportunities for families with a range of needs to have access to these services, which the literature and our work has really started to point in the direction of being beneficial in the long term for kids and families. So I'll wrap it up there and I will turn it over to Anne for any final words and to answer any questions.
Thanks, Melissa and Cara, and to our hosts and participants. There's a really active chat conversation here and some wonderful input. So scanning that, I think I'll make some comments and attempt to answer some questions, but keep them coming. First off, one of the themes that Melissa certainly observed and elevated to some extent that is worthy of a little bit more discussion is the notion that many of these families are born into intergenerational poverty. And at this point in our history, we have a lot of structural reasons that exist and structural reasons why it's maintained. So yes, there are housing corridors in this country. The work that we did in Bridgeport sits in one of the top 10 most expensive housing corridors in the country. Transportation is really challenging. And this is not just true in Connecticut, this is true in many places in this country. So that families who have limited income, more specifically families who meet the federal definition of poverty, are really between a rock and a hard place. Rents are well above the AMI, area mean income, well above 30% of the AMI. And so the circumstance for such a family, particularly a family with young children who has a number of mouths to feed, and let's face it, parenthood is expensive. So particularly in early childhood, we have families who have diapers and formula and childcare and are also working to really advance their own economic circumstances. Very often, these are families that are, again, born into intergenerational cycles of poverty. When we looked at the families at ABCD, and this is common among Head Start participants, there are, in fact, lots of aspirations about moving along the economic scale and lots of barriers in the way. And some of those are really related to housing. Some of the barriers that relate to housing are deeply related to the structural inequities that exist in our society today. We know that a disproportionate number of people who live in poverty are Black and brown folks. We know that we've had policies that really made it very challenging for individuals who were born into poverty and are of minority background to attain mortgages and to move into neighborhoods that are more neighborhoods of choice for them. There is some emerging research that says that moving families into neighborhoods of choice where there are more resources available is really, that in of itself is good for families. And in some ways that's not surprising. At the same time, we know that a rising tide does not necessarily lift all boats, and that's something to really keep in mind. I think the work here has a few really important take-home messages, and you've already said many of them. One is that we have to really stop thinking about homelessness and housing instability as something that's blameworthy. There are lots of structural reasons for it. And the treatment of individuals receiving supports or eligible for these supports, similar to your comment, the ABCD workers who do this family support work were really clear with us that many of the families that they encounter are interfacing with systems that aren't very friendly. And we know that systems are comprised of people, and we're part of those systems. So our posture toward families and our posture toward our colleagues in those systems really needs to be a positive one that's oriented around accepting families where they are, and sometimes maybe gently prompting others to do that too. So we're in the process of trying to figure out where to take this work. I see a comment from someone asking about how to put this in front of funders, from Stacy Herbert, and from other people too on this chat. So how do we get this in front of people? We're gonna work hard in the weeks and months to come to disseminate some of this information. We often get questions about whether people can just start using the QRAFT, and so let me address some of that. Number one, we think being aware of these family circumstances at all times is really important. Secondly, it's really important to know what the resources and points of entry are in your own community. Melissa talked before about the COC. as a starting point. In most communities, there's some form of hotline or point of entry for folks experiencing deep housing instability or homelessness. Some of those work better than others. We'll be talking in more structural terms from a policy standpoint whenever we can at Chapin Hall about policies that might make it easier for families to access these resources, first of all. And secondly, we don't have sufficient housing vouchers for the number of people with deep housing instability and homelessness in this country. We have a deep body of research that tells us that Section 8, AKA housing choice vouchers, really work to keep people housed. However, we spend much more in the federal budget every year with mortgage interest deductions for people like me than we do on housing vouchers. And I'm not suggesting that we equalize that. I'm suggesting that we have a national conversation about housing and we start thinking about housing as an investment that may well have a long-term payoff. Melissa referenced some work we did on supportive housing for families involved in the child welfare system. And a short summary of that is that families who received housing vouchers and wraparound case management who had some involvement in the child welfare system not only had very significant improvement in child welfare outcomes on average, those interventions were actually less expensive than child welfare business as usual. So we need to start making the cost argument about housing, and it's challenging to convince funders to stick with us long enough to really address the long-term outcomes here. There is, you probably know, I'm speaking to an audience of early childhood providers, you know that some of the best research we have is about the payoff from early childhood education and care, high quality early childhood education and care. And that's the intention of Head Start and Early Head Start. And our work at ABCD told us very convincingly that those workers and their contacts with families were a really important support. Not only were they as an important support, they were an important platform for families to be able to verbalize what their needs are and to get real about those needs and to reach out for support. We are loath to screen for concerns when we don't have resources to meet them. And I think when people ask us about using the QRAF, that's one of our first answers, is what resources are in place, what systems are you connected with in your program that this could feed? And the second answer is, of course, please get in touch with us. We don't want people just using this without those resources and without training. We gave you a very light rendition of the kind of work that we did to prepare together with our partners to embark on this work. So we invite you to get in touch with us. We have some documents and reports that we're happy to share, and we'll be sharing more across time. So with that, we'd like to answer any other questions that are out there.
Yeah, so please use your chat box if you do have any other questions. Sorry, not to lose my voice. I don't see any coming in right now, but as new questions come in, we can address those as we wrap up here. Okay. I'm going to turn it over briefly to Rebecca Schwartz. Rebecca can tell you a little bit about the Early Childhood Collective and the work that they've been doing around homelessness as well. So Rebecca, you have control. But you probably don't have a mic, so hang on, let me get your mic going. Okay.
All right, is everyone able to hear me then?
Yes.
Great, so thank you so much to our presenters for coming to give us so much background about the reasons families find themselves in these difficult situations and how early childhood providers and systems can help. Again, this webinar was co-sponsored by the Early Intervention Training Program, as well as the Illinois Early Learning Project. Both of our projects are part of the Early Childhood Collective in the Department of Special Education at the University of Illinois. We hope that you'll take a chance to look at our website and explore what our projects have to offer. We're a group of both state and federally funded programs that touch early childhood topics across early intervention, the birth to 3, and into the early childhood years. And we have many resources to offer you. We hope you'll reach out to us with questions and your needs. I'm going to advance the slide, Maria. Let's see if it works. Okay, so the reason that we were able to bring this wonderful webinar to you is in part because we are currently in the middle of a grant from the Administration for Children and Families that is run through the Governor's Office for Early Childhood Development here in the state of Illinois. The Illinois Early Learning Project staff was tasked with creating a toolkit of resources to help folks learn more about the issues of homelessness and young children, and as well to help develop resources that can help programs, help families make choices that benefit their families. So we have several different resources that are part of this, and I'm going to see if it works. There we go. So if you would like to look at these resources and continue your learning, you can simply go to Toolkits, and you can find the toolkit about supporting young children, families with young children experiencing homelessness, and you'll see that there are drop downs where you can find out about getting started, how to identify families, as well as the kinds of resources that families need for basic needs, their educational rights, and for building well-being, because as we know, we want to help families build that stable housing history, as we learned from our presenters, and build the resources that they need to move forward and stabilize and develop the kinds of family situations that can support young children's development. So we also, as part of this, have included some of our podcasts about trauma in the lives of young children, so you can continue your learning there, and have some new tip sheets. I'm going to show one of them here, which are aimed to help families understand the rights that they do have under McKinney-Vento to maintain their enrollment in school, and that includes in early childhood programs, when they experience homelessness or housing instability. So we hope that you will share these throughout the state and with the families and programs that you serve. I will let you know that translations of these tip sheets are forthcoming, just as there are many other tip sheets, which you can see over here. We have about 200 on the website on other topics that you can share with families. And lastly, the other thing that we have created as far as this resource toolkit is a resource directory. I know that, sorry, the pop-ups are coming. I know that our presenters pointed to the importance of understanding who your local continuum of care agency is. And so our resource directory is organized to help you find those things, so you can find your local community action agency, see if the 211 hotline serves your area to help families find emergency resources, and then specific resources related to basic needs, educational rights, and finding early care and education services, as well as improving their well-being. And you'll see that, for example, under housing, I'm going to go right to housing, because we decided food, shelter, and clothing, we would organize that way. You can find out about the programs that are here in Illinois that are in your area to help refer families on. And there's that listing of your continuum of care agencies. Simply click those links and it'll take you to the information that you need for your local area. So we at the Illinois Early Learning Project are happy to answer questions and help refer you in your local area. So feel free to contact us at iel@illinois.edu. All right, Maria, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, let me take it back over here real quick. With that being said, thank you so much. I know you guys worked really hard on putting this together, and I hope that the folks who are on the webinar take a look at these resources. They really have just so much wealth of information in here. So we are pausing here we just have a few more minutes for final questions. And it looked like there was a question that came up from COXA. What is the homeless rate in Connecticut compared to the national average?
So can't do quick enough tap dancing on that one. So I can tell you, I can repeat what I know from heart is that 3 of the most expensive housing corridors in the nation reside in Connecticut, and so there's a lot of press, and so there's a statistic that's often used that relates how many minimum wage jobs a person would have to have in order to qualify for the smallest 1-bedroom apartment. And in Connecticut, it's 2.3. And so we can imagine that for families with young children, a 1-bedroom apartment, and I'll be honest with you, in many of these metropolitan areas, not just in Connecticut, but all over the country, of course, it's not doable. Most of these are single heads of household circumstances, so having 2.3 minimum wage jobs is not even possible because a person can't work 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, and so that is part of it. Estimating homelessness is really challenging. So here at Chapin Hall, we've done counts of youth homelessness, and we've not looked at family homelessness specifically. So what starts to happen when we ask about the prevalence of housing instability and homelessness is that we have some figures that come from looking at the number of people who are living in or seeking shelter. That's one source of statistics. Another source of statistics is by doing actual counts, and you might hear about this, that there are point-in-time counts of typically it's homelessness. In the last 2 or 3 years, we conducted point-in-time counts with 22 different counties in the United States. That was of youth homelessness. A good proportion of the young people who are experiencing homelessness that we spoke to, a disproportionate number of them were parents of young children. So we actually found that 1 in 10 young people between the ages of 18 and 25 had experienced some form of housing instability or homelessness in the preceding 12 months. And about 1 in 30 between the ages of 13 and 18 had experienced some form. And when we talk about some form, we're including doubled up and those untenable circumstances in the definition. When you start to try to look at prevalence of homelessness at a state or county or regional level, it's very, very difficult to estimate. So even if we had figures on Connecticut's prevalence of homelessness, I don't know that I'd want to hang my hat on them because no one's terribly confident about those numbers. So there are more accurate prevalence estimates probably for veterans homelessness, but we just don't really have a very good handle on it. We have a better handle on measuring the proportion of families who are in unsustainable housing circumstances with respect to percentage of area mean income and those kinds of things. But it's very difficult to actually quantify which areas have deeper prevalence of homelessness. And I'm sorry if that seems evasive, but I think it's actually the state of the circumstances.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's, it's hard to measure those types of things. And you gave a lot of good information for people to think about. So it is 2:30. I'm going to just wrap up. I want to thank Anne and Melissa and Cara and Rebecca for all the wealth of information they've shared for us. We hope you all appreciated and enjoyed our webinar today. If you have any, if you are looking for EI credit, be sure to complete that survey for the evaluation, and then you will get your certificate for attendance within 24 hours after you complete that survey. With that being said, I want to put a plug out there for our winter webinar series that we will be starting in late January, and wish you all happy holidays. Thank you so much.
Thank you.